You are putting us all at risk with these allegations. I'm telling the truth.
I know what I saw, and so do they. The record is clear, officer. You wanted to see my credentials?
I didn't realize. Please proceed.
He thought he could control the room, until the room changed on him. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly above the precinct floor, casting a cold, sterile glow over polished tiles and tired faces. The kind of place where authority was worn like armor and silence often said more than words ever could. And right there, in the middle of it all, Angela Carter stood still, calm, composed, as if the tension pressing in from every corner couldn't quite reach her, her posture straight, her eyes steady, not defiant, not afraid, just aware, and that was what made Officer Daniel Brooks pause for half a second longer than usual, though he quickly masked it with a scoff, adjusting the weight of his badge like it gave him certainty, like it reminded everyone who was in charge, because in his world, people like her didn't walk into places like this without a reason he could question, without a story he could control. "You're in the wrong place," he muttered, his tone low but sharp enough to cut through the quiet murmurs around them, and a few nearby officers glanced over, not surprised, not curious, just watching the way people do when they've seen this pattern before. Angela didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't even shift her stance, and that silence stretched, thin and uncomfortable, like something unseen was building beneath it. "I asked you a question," Daniel pressed, louder now, stepping closer, trying to force a reaction, because control, to him, meant noise, meant dominance, meant pushing until something cracked. But Angela only lifted her gaze, slightly, meeting his eyes with a calm that didn't match the situation, a calm that didn't belong there. And for a moment, just a flicker, something in his expression tightened, like doubt brushing against certainty, but it passed just as quickly, replaced by a sharper edge. "You think you can just walk in here and ignore me?" he said, his voice echoing faintly against the walls, and somewhere behind him, a radio crackled, a distant reminder that the world outside kept moving, even as this moment slowed to a crawl. Imagine standing there, surrounded by people who've already decided who you are, feeling the weight of their assumptions before you've even spoken a word, and still choosing not to react, because you know something they don't. Angela's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her coat, not nervous, not fidgeting, just deliberate, like every movement had purpose, and Daniel noticed, of course he did, his eyes narrowing slightly, misreading it as hesitation, as weakness, as something he could use. "Last chance," he said, his tone dropping again, quieter now, but heavier. "Explain why you're here." And the room seemed to lean in, subtle but real, as if even the air was waiting, and Angela finally spoke, her voice even, controlled, almost gentle. "You might want to be careful with that question," she said, and it wasn't a threat, not in the way he expected. It was something else, something that didn't fit his script, something that didn't give him the reaction he needed to keep playing his role. And that was when the shift began. Small at first, barely noticeable, but real enough that one officer near the back straightened slightly, his gaze flicking between them, sensing what Daniel couldn't yet see, because in that moment, Daniel still believed he was in control, still believed this was just another encounter he could push through, just another person he could define, and he had no idea that the ground beneath him was already starting to move. Daniel Brooks let out a short breath through his nose, the kind that came when patience ran thin but pride refused to step back, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of his duty belt as he studied her more closely now, as if trying to find the flaw, the crack, the reason she did not react the way everyone else usually did, because in his experience people either argued or apologized, they raised their voices or lowered their eyes. But they did not stand there like Angela Carter, steady and unshaken, like the moment itself did not belong to him. And that unsettled something deep beneath his confidence, even if he would never admit it out loud. "Careful," he repeated, a faint smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth as he leaned in just enough to reassert his presence, his voice quieter but edged with challenge. "You are the one standing in my station with no explanation." And a few officers nearby shifted their weight, subtle movements that betrayed their attention, because now it was no longer just another routine interaction. Now it felt like something was stretching beyond the usual script. Angela tilted her head slightly, not in submission but in observation, her eyes moving past him for a fraction of a second, scanning the room, noting the exits, the desks, the small security camera mounted high in the corner blinking its silent red light. And then she looked back at him, that same calm expression untouched. "I gave you one," she said softly, and the simplicity of her answer seemed to irritate him more than defiance ever could, because it did not feed his authority, it did not give him something to push against, it simply existed, and that made him raise his voice again, sharper this time. "No, you gave me nothing," he snapped, straightening his posture, drawing the attention of more eyes now. The low murmur in the room fading as conversation slowed and heads turned, and somewhere behind the front desk, a younger officer named Kevin shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward Angela with a hint of uncertainty, as if something about her presence did not match the situation unfolding. But he said nothing, because this was not his place to interfere, not with someone like Brooks leading the exchange. "You think staying quiet makes you smart?" Daniel continued, pacing a slow step to the side, circling just enough to re-establish control over the space. "All it does is make you look suspicious." And for the first time, Angela's expression changed, not into fear, not into anger, but into something almost reflective, as if she had heard those words before, as if they carried a weight that extended far beyond this room. "Suspicion says more about the person holding it," she replied, her voice still even, still controlled, and that was when a faint ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because that line landed differently. It did not escalate the conflict, it reframed it, and Daniel felt it. The shift, the way the attention around them leaned ever so slightly away from him, and his jaw tightened in response, his control slipping just enough to make him push harder. "Do not play games with me," he said, each word measured now, deliberate, as if forcing the situation back into his grasp. "You are either going to cooperate, or you are going to make this harder for yourself." And the threat hung there, not loud, not explosive, but heavy enough that the air seemed to press down around them. And still, Angela did not move, did not argue, did not step back. Instead, she reached into her coat slowly, deliberately, her movements calm but unmistakably intentional. And that single motion sent a ripple of tension through the room. A few officers straightening, Daniel's eyes narrowing as his focus locked onto her hand, his mind already forming assumptions, already preparing to respond, because in his world, that kind of movement always meant escalation, always meant he was about to take control again. But what he did not see, what he could not see yet, was that this moment was not building toward his authority, it was building toward something else entirely. Something already set in motion long before she ever walked through those doors. For a split second, everything seemed to slow, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights stretching into something heavier, the quiet shifting of boots on tile sounding louder than it should, and Daniel's eyes locked onto Angela's hand as it moved inside her coat, deliberate, unhurried, controlled in a way that did not match the tension he believed he had created. And that was the first crack. The first moment where instinct whispered something was off, but pride refused to listen, because in his mind, this was still his space, his rules, his authority. "Stop right there," he said quickly, his voice cutting through the air with sharp precision, not loud, but commanding enough that the room stilled again, a few officers straightening instinctively, Kevin near the desk holding his breath without realizing it, and Angela paused, not because she had to, but because she chose to, her hand remaining inside her coat for just a moment longer before she slowly drew it back out. Empty, open, nothing threatening, nothing sudden, just a simple, controlled motion that made Daniel's command feel heavier than necessary. And that was the second crack, smaller but deeper, because now the tension he tried to build had nowhere to go. It just hung there, visible to everyone watching. "You see," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room without effort. That reaction right there, and she let the words settle, not rushing, not pushing, just allowing them to exist. "It tells me more than anything you have said so far." And a faint ripple passed through the officers behind him. Not laughter, not agreement, just awareness, the kind that shifts how a moment is perceived. And Daniel felt it, the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way attention was no longer fully anchored to him. And that made him step forward again, closing the distance, reclaiming space, reclaiming control. You do not get to analyze me, he replied, his tone tightening, each word more deliberate than the last. You are here to answer questions, not ask them. And Angela met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. But now there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something resolute, as if the moment she had been waiting for was approaching. Then ask the right ones, she said, and that line landed differently, heavier, because it did not challenge his authority directly. It challenged his judgment, and that was something far more difficult to defend. And for a brief moment, Daniel hesitated, not visibly, not enough for most to notice, but enough that Kevin's eyes flicked up again, catching it, sensing the imbalance that was beginning to form. And then, just as quickly, Daniel pushed forward, because hesitation was not something he allowed to exist, not here, not in front of others. Fine, he said, his voice sharper now, louder, reclaiming attention. Who are you, and why are you here? And the question echoed slightly, bouncing off the walls, settling into the silence that followed. And Angela exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, not out of fear, but as if she had reached the exact point she needed, her fingers brushing once more against the inside of her coat, this time with no interruption, no command stopping her, because the room itself seemed to hold still, waiting. And as she drew something out, small, rectangular, catching just a hint of the overhead light, Daniel's focus narrowed, his mind already preparing a response, already shaping the narrative he would control. But what he did not realize, what none of them fully understood yet, was that this was not a response to his question, it was the answer to everything that had already happened, and the moment it was revealed, nothing in that room would feel the same again. The object caught the light just enough to draw every eye in the room without a single word needing to be spoken, a small, polished surface reflecting the sterile glow above, and for a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, because something about that motion, that calm, deliberate reveal, did not belong to the version of events Daniel had built in his mind. And yet he held his ground, his jaw set, his posture firm, because stepping back now would mean admitting something he was not ready to face. What is that supposed to be? He asked, his voice carrying a sharper edge than before, not louder, but tighter, like controls slipping through his fingers 1 second at a time. And Angela did not answer immediately. She did not rush. She simply turned the object slightly, letting the engraved surface face him fully, letting the details settle into view, the insignia, the lettering, the weight of it. And as his eyes scanned it, something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, like recognition trying to surface but being pushed back down by disbelief. That does not change anything, he said quickly, almost too quickly, as if speaking fast enough could reshape reality, could pull the moment back into something he understood. But the room had already changed, the silence now thicker, heavier, charged with a new kind of awareness. Kevin leaned forward slightly from behind the desk, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the badge from a distance. And another officer near the back straightened, his earlier indifference gone, replaced by a quiet alertness, because this was no longer just about authority. This was about truth, and truth had a way of moving through a room faster than orders ever could. Angela took a single step forward, closing the distance not in challenge, but in clarity, her voice steady, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. It changes everything, she said, and there was no force in her tone, no anger, just certainty, the kind that does not need to raise its volume to be heard. And Daniel felt it, the shift pressing in from all sides now, the way the room no longer stood behind him the way it had just minutes ago, the way eyes that once followed his lead were now watching him, evaluating, questioning. And for the first time, the space he thought he controlled began to feel unfamiliar, like ground that no longer held steady beneath his feet. You expect me to believe that? He said, but the question did not land the way he intended. It did not challenge her, it exposed him, because belief was no longer the point. The evidence was already there, and everyone could see it, everyone except the part of him still trying to hold on. You already do, Angela replied quietly, and that was when the sound came. Footsteps from the hallway, firm, purposeful, moving with intent, and every head turned instinctively, because those steps carried something different, something heavier than routine. The door at the end of the room opening with a controlled force, revealing two figures in dark suits, their presence immediately shifting the air, not loud, not aggressive, but undeniable, the kind of presence that did not ask for attention, it commanded it simply by existing. And as they stepped inside, their eyes moved directly to Angela, not to Daniel, not to anyone else, just to her. And one of them gave a small, respectful nod. "Ma'am," he said, clear, direct, leaving no ambiguity in who they were addressing. And in that single word, the entire room seemed to tilt, because now it was no longer a question of authority, it was a confirmation of it, and Daniel's breath caught, just slightly, just enough to betray the realization he had been resisting, because the moment he thought he controlled had never been his at all. It had belonged to her from the very beginning. The word lingered in the air like a quiet verdict. Ma'am, simple, respectful, undeniable. And in that single moment, the entire balance of the room shifted in a way no one could ignore. Daniel Brooks felt it before he could process it. A subtle tightening in his chest, a pause in his breath, the kind of instinct that tells you something has gone wrong long before your mind catches up. And yet he stood there, rooted in place, his posture still rigid, still trying to hold onto the authority that had just slipped from his grasp. "What is going on here?" he asked. But the question no longer carried command. It carried uncertainty, and that difference did not go unnoticed. The two agents stepped further into the room, their presence calm but precise, one of them holding a slim folder at his side, the other scanning the room briefly before returning his attention to Angela, not as a suspect, not as a distraction, but as the center of the situation. "We have been expecting you," the second agent said, his tone professional, measured, and Angela gave a slight nod in return, acknowledging them without breaking her composure, without needing to assert anything further, because the truth was already unfolding in front of everyone. Daniel's eyes moved between them, then back to the badge in her hand, then to her face, searching for something that would make sense of what he was seeing, something that would restore the narrative he had built just minutes ago. But there was nothing to hold on to, no sign that this was a misunderstanding, no hint that he could correct it. And that was when the room truly changed. Officers who had once stood casually now straightened, their attention no longer passive. Kevin took a small step forward, his expression shifting from uncertainty to realization, because now the pieces were aligning. Now the situation was becoming clear in a way that could not be ignored. "Internal affairs," the agent with the folder said, opening it just enough to reveal the official documentation inside, the insignia matching the badge Angela still held with steady fingers. "We have been conducting an ongoing review," he continued, his voice even, factual, not accusatory, not emotional, simply stating what was. And that was what made it heavier, because there was no argument to push against, no tone to challenge, just the weight of truth settling into place. Daniel's jaw tightened, his mind racing now, not to dominate, but to understand, to find a way out, to locate the moment where this could have been different. "Review of what?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer, already felt it pressing in from every direction. Angela lowered the badge slightly, but did not put it away, her gaze steady on him, not cold, not cruel, just unwavering. "Conduct," she said, and the single word carried more than any explanation could. It echoed through the room, touching every glance, every shift in posture, every silent realization forming in the minds of those watching. And Daniel felt it settle on him fully now, the weight of every assumption he had made, every step he had taken, every word he had spoken, all of it being seen from a perspective he had never considered. And for the first time, he was not the one observing, not the one judging, he was the one being evaluated, the one standing in the center of a situation he no longer controlled. And the realization did not come loudly. It came quietly, like a slow, steady pressure that left no room to escape. The kind that does not need force to make its point, because it simply exists, undeniable and complete. And as Angela took one final step back, creating just enough distance to redefine the space between them, it became clear to everyone in that room that this was not the beginning of an incident. It was the end of something that had been building long before today. The word conduct did not echo loudly. It settled, slow and heavy, like something that had been waiting its turn to be heard. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because they were realizing what had already been said, what had already been seen. Daniel Brooks stood there, his shoulders still squared, his stance still firm, but the certainty that once filled that posture had thinned, replaced by something quieter, something less defined. And he could feel the eyes now, not the passive glances from before, but focused, deliberate attention, the kind that evaluates instead of follows, the kind that does not assume but observes. And it changed everything. "This is not necessary," he said finally, his voice measured, controlled, reaching for stability. "If there has been a misunderstanding, we can clear it up right here." And the phrasing was careful, intentional, because now he was no longer asserting, he was negotiating. And that shift did not go unnoticed. One of the agents closed the folder softly, the sound subtle but final, like the end of a conversation that had already been decided elsewhere. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied calmly, and the absence of emotion in his tone made it impossible to challenge, because it did not invite debate. It simply stated reality. Angela watched Daniel without expression, not with satisfaction, not with anger, just with a steady awareness, as if she had seen this moment before in different forms, different places, with different faces, and she knew exactly how it unfolded. "You evaluated the situation," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without drawing attention away from the weight already present. "You made a decision," and each word felt precise, not accusatory, not exaggerated, just factual. And that made it heavier than any raised voice ever could. Daniel opened his mouth slightly, then paused, the response he had prepared no longer fitting the situation, because it was built for a different version of this moment, one where he held control, one where his words defined the outcome. But that version was gone now, replaced by something he could not shape. "You did not have all the information," he said. And this time it was not a challenge, it was an explanation, an attempt to reposition himself within a narrative that was quickly moving beyond his reach. Angela nodded once, a small acknowledgement that did not agree, did not disagree, just recognized the statement for what it was. "That is the point," she replied, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than anything else, because it removed every excuse, every justification, every assumption that had been built into the moment. The room remained still, but it was no longer tense in the same way. The uncertainty had been replaced by clarity, and clarity has a weight of its own. Kevin lowered his gaze briefly, processing what he had witnessed, understanding how quickly a situation could shift when seen from a different perspective, and around him. Others did the same, small movements, quiet realizations, the kind that do not need to be spoken to be understood. Daniel exhaled slowly, the first sign of release, not from tension, but from resistance, because holding on to something that no longer exists requires effort, and that effort was beginning to show. "What happens now?" he asked, and the question was no longer about control, it was about consequence, and Angela took a step forward, not to close distance, but to define it, her presence steady, composed, unchanged from the moment she walked in. "Now," she said, her voice even, grounded, "we let the process do what it is supposed to do." And there was no threat in it, no promise of anything dramatic, just the quiet certainty of accountability, the kind that does not need to be forced because it is already in motion. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was not about one interaction, not about one decision. It was about something larger, something that had been building long before today, something that would continue long after this moment ended. And Daniel Brooks, standing in the center of it all, understood for the first time that authority is not defined by the badge you wear, but by the responsibility you carry. And when that balance is broken, the correction does not come with noise, it comes with truth. The word process settled into the room like a quiet line drawn in place, not dramatic, not loud, but final in a way that no one could ignore. And for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant echo of a radio transmission somewhere deeper in the building. Life continuing just beyond the edges of this moment. Daniel Brooks stood still, his hands no longer resting, with the same certainty at his sides, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in control, because control had shifted, not through force, not through volume, but through clarity, and clarity has a way of stripping everything down to what it truly is. Process. He repeated under his breath, as if testing the word, as if trying to understand how something so simple could carry so much weight. And Angela watched him, not with judgment, not with satisfaction, but with a steady presence. That did not need to assert itself, because it already existed. It is not personal, she said, her voice even, measured, offering no comfort, but no cruelty either, just truth. It is responsibility. And that distinction hung in the air, separating emotion from accountability, intention from outcome. And for the first time, Daniel's gaze shifted, not outward, not toward the agents or the room, but inward, as if he were replaying the last few minutes in his mind, seeing them not from his perspective, but from hers, from theirs, from the quiet lens that had been observing all along. And it changed the way the moment felt. Kevin stepped slightly to the side, giving space without being told, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet understanding that this was no longer something to watch from a distance. This was something to learn from, something that would stay with him long after this moment passed. The agent with the folder took a small step forward, not aggressive, not imposing, just enough to signal the next phase, the continuation of what had already begun. "Officer Brooks," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "we are going to need you to come with us." And there was no tension in the request, no urgency, just inevitability, the kind that does not rush because it does not need to. And Daniel nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the motion small but significant, because it was the first time he responded without resistance, without trying to redirect or regain control. It was acceptance, quiet and measured, and as he moved, just one step forward, the room seemed to shift again, not in tension, but in release, like something that had been held too tightly was finally let go. Angela lowered her hand, the badge now resting at her side, no longer the center of attention because its purpose had already been fulfilled, and she glanced briefly around the room, not to command it, not to claim it, but to acknowledge it, the officers, the space, the moment itself. And in that glance there was something unspoken, something that reached beyond this situation, something about awareness, about the choices made in small moments that build into something larger. Over time, Daniel paused before taking another step, his voice quieter now, stripped of the sharp edges it once carried. "I did not see it," he said, not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a realization, and Angela met his words with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. "That is why we are here," she replied, and there was no triumph in it, no sense of victory, just purpose. And that purpose filled the space where conflict once stood. The agents moved with him toward the hallway, their presence steady, guiding but not forcing, because the moment no longer required force, it required follow-through. And as the door opened once more, letting in the distant sounds of the station beyond, it became clear that what had happened here would not end in this room. It would continue, through reports, through reviews, through conversations that would echo in quiet ways, shaping decisions yet to come. And Angela remained where she was for a moment longer, standing in the same place where it all began, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. Because for her, this was never about the moment itself. It was about what the moment revealed. And as she finally turned to leave, the room felt different, not because of what had been taken away, but because of what had been seen. The door closed behind them with a soft, controlled sound, not loud enough to startle, but firm enough to mark a boundary. And for a moment the room remained exactly as it was, frozen in the space that followed something irreversible, the kind of silence that does not rush to fill itself, because everyone inside it is still processing what just happened. Kevin exhaled slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath until now, his eyes lingering on the spot where Daniel had stood, replaying the exchange in his mind, not the words alone, but the tone, the posture, the small decisions that had built into something far larger than any single moment. And around him, the others shifted, some returning to their desks, some pretending to resume their tasks, but none of it was the same, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Angela remained still for a few seconds longer, her presence calm, grounded, as if the weight of the room did not press against her the way it did against everyone else. And then she moved, Not hurried, not delayed, just intentional, walking toward the center of the space with the same quiet control she had carried from the beginning, her eyes briefly scanning the faces around her, not searching for reactions, not measuring responses, just acknowledging what was there, the awareness, the questions, the quiet shifts that had already begun to take root. "This is not about one moment," she said, her voice steady, clear enough to reach without effort, and the room stilled again, not out of obligation, but because people were listening differently now. "It never is," she continued, her gaze moving from one officer to another, not singling anyone out, but including everyone in what she was saying. "It is about patterns, about the choices made when no one is watching, and the ones made when everyone is." And her words did not accuse, did not target. They simply laid something out that could not be argued with, because each person in that room could feel where it applied, could recognize moments of their own, small decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. Kevin lowered his eyes briefly, the weight of that realization settling in quietly, and then looked back up, not in discomfort, but in understanding, because something had shifted inside him, something that would not fade when the day ended. Angela took another step forward, stopping near the desk where Kevin stood, not close enough to invade space, but close enough to make the moment personal without making it uncomfortable. "Authority is not tested when things are easy," she said, her tone still even, still calm. "It is tested when assumptions are challenged, when situations are unclear, when the person in front of you does not fit the expectation you already decided on." And that line settled deeper than anything else, because it did not just describe what had happened, it explained why it mattered, why it would continue to matter long after this room returned to its routine. A faint sound of movement came from the hallway beyond, distant voices, the rhythm of the station continuing as it always had. But inside this room, the rhythm had changed, slower, more deliberate, more aware. Angela glanced once toward the door, then back to the room, as if measuring the space one last time. "What happened here will be reviewed," she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of process, of continuity. "But what matters more is what happens after." And she let that linger, not filling the silence that followed, allowing it to exist, allowing each person to sit with it, to interpret it, to carry it forward in their own way. Kevin nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, the motion small but meaningful, because it marked the moment where observation turned into understanding and understanding into responsibility. Angela gave a final, subtle nod to the room, not of approval, not of dismissal, but of acknowledgement, and then she turned, walking toward the same door Daniel had exited moments earlier, her steps steady, unhurried, the same as when she entered. And as she reached the threshold, she paused for just a fraction of a second, not looking back, not needing to, because what needed to be seen had already been seen, and then she stepped through, leaving the room not empty, but changed, in a way that would not be undone by time. Because some moments do not end when they are over, they echo, quietly, shaping what comes next. The hallway felt different from the moment before, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with what had just unfolded. The steady rhythm of footsteps echoing softly against the polished floor as Angela moved forward, the agents walking beside her not as protectors, but as part of a process already in motion. And behind them, through the closed door, the weight of that room lingered, not as tension anymore, but as awareness, the kind that settles slowly and stays. Daniel Brooks walked a few steps ahead, his posture no longer rigid with certainty, but not collapsed either, just altered, recalibrated in a way that could not be undone by denial. And for the first time since the moment began, he was not thinking about control, he was thinking about consequence. Not in fear, not in panic, but in recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and refuses to leave. "I have been here 12 years, he said after a moment, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharpness it once carried, not directed at anyone in particular, but spoken into the space as if the walls themselves needed to hear it. And one of the agents glanced at him briefly, not dismissing the statement, not validating it either, just acknowledging it for what it was, a piece of context that no longer changed the outcome. Angela slowed slightly, just enough for her presence to align with his pace, not overtaking, not trailing behind, but level, balanced. Experience does not replace awareness, she said, her tone steady, not harsh, not soft, simply true. And Daniel nodded once, the motion small but genuine, because this time there was no argument forming behind his eyes, no resistance building in his posture. Just understanding taking shape where assumption once lived. They reached a glass partition that separated the main hallway from a quieter section of the building, the reflection in it catching them for a brief moment. 3 figures moving forward under the same light, but carrying very different weight, and Daniel glanced at it, just for a second, seeing himself not as he had been minutes ago, but as he was now, standing in a moment that had shifted everything. And something in that reflection held longer than he expected, not out of vanity, not out of doubt, but out of recognition. Because the person he saw there was not defined by what had just happened, but by what he chose to do next. What happens after this? He asked, the question quieter than before, not seeking an escape, not searching for reassurance, just asking for truth. And Angela met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, grounded, composed. That depends on what you do with what you have seen, she replied, and there was no ambiguity in it, no hidden meaning, just a clear path forward that did not promise ease, only accountability. They continued walking, the sound of their steps steady, consistent, as if the building itself was guiding them through a process it had seen many times before. And yet, for Daniel, this was new, not because of the procedure, but because of the clarity, because of the moment that forced him to see beyond habit, beyond assumption, beyond the quiet patterns that form when they are never questioned. And as they approached the next door, marked with a simple plaque that carried no dramatic title, just a designation, a place where conversations would continue, where records would be reviewed, where decisions would be made without noise or spectacle. Angela paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but to mark the transition, the shift from what had been witnessed to what would now be addressed. And as the door opened, the light inside was softer, less harsh than the fluorescent glare of the main floor, almost neutral, as if the space itself was designed to remove distraction, to focus only on what mattered. Daniel stepped forward first, not guided, not pushed, but choosing to move, and that choice, small as it was, carried more weight than anything he had done earlier, because it was not driven by control. It was driven by awareness, and as he crossed the threshold, Angela followed, her presence steady, her role unchanged, not as someone who had taken something from him, but as someone who had revealed something to him. And the door closed behind them once more, not with finality, but with continuity, because this was not the end of the story. It was the point where the real work began, the quiet, consistent work of aligning action with responsibility, of ensuring that authority is not just worn, but understood, and somewhere, beyond the walls of that room, beyond the hallway, beyond the building itself, the idea of justice remained exactly what it had always been, not loud, not immediate, but steady, waiting for those who carry it to recognize what it truly requires.